Just so you know, next week, kids will have program for preschool, for K to 5, and then for grades 6 and 7 as well. We just don't have teachers yet today, so that will be happening next week. We'll be fully functioning in our kids' ministries as well. So today we're starting a new series. I'm actually kind of excited because for the longest time I've had to tape my manuscript down because of the wind outside, but I don't need to do that today. The series is going to take us up to Advent actually, and I'm excited about this series because the principles are so relevant and so powerful for our lives today. The series is actually based on a book. I'm not going to tell you the name of the book but the first picture in the book, the verbal picture that it gives, is to think about life as a puzzle. Now, I brought a puzzle. I have a puzzle. And I lay that puzzle out. I'm not a huge puzzle person, by the way. My wife loves puzzles. But if we lay that puzzle out, we start working at that puzzle and you spread it out before you. And that puzzle is there on the table, and it's beautiful. I mean, the colors of this puzzle are great. It's bright, it's vibrant. There are a lot of pieces. And so you sit down and you start this project. I don't know how you do a puzzle. I think probably most people go through and find the border pieces first, right? Anybody there with me? Right? Okay. So I'm going through this puzzle, and I can't find any border pieces. There's no border. And then I look through it and I realize some of these pieces don't look like they go with this puzzle. Like, I think somebody put two puzzles in the same box. I'm looking through that and I think that doesn't sound very good because I'm not a puzzler in the first place, and now it just got worse. It's like, how am I supposed to put this thing together? And in my humanity, fine, I'm done. But this is a puzzle you can't walk away from. This isn't a puzzle that you can say, I don't want to do that. This isn't a puzzle that says it doesn't matter. You see, just because it's messed up, and by the way, there's no picture to follow. Have you ever tried to do a puzzle? No boundary, no picture. I would box that back up and put it on the shelf. Probably I'd throw it in the garbage, actually, and just say, enough. But I can't, because this is life. This puzzle is life. Our lives as we live in community with each other, it's not so easy, and it doesn't always look like we know exactly where to go, what the boundaries are, what the boundaries aren't. How do we deal with certain situations? How do we go through life? We're talking about life, and it's just not laid out so simple. And these puzzles are this puzzle is like our home even. Could be our home, our families, our parents, our child relationships, because life is about relationship. Isn't something that we can just decide to do or not to do, because it's people, it's community, it's being a church family, it's being a family, it's being those relationships. I've got 3 kids. They're not kids anymore, they're all adults. One of them's married. I've already bragged, finally, I have 2 grandkids. One is only 2 weeks old. I'm still excited. I've only seen him online so far. But we're going to get there. They live in Seattle. All 3 of my kids are different. I have 3 brothers. Believe me, we are all different. There's a lot of similarities. We grew up in the same house. There's a lot of similarities, but there's differences too. We're all different, so it's not like one size fits all. If I'm the exact same person and same parent with all of them, they all have different needs and they all see life a little bit different. And we need to have an understanding of that. Every friendship, every relationship is different. Every church relationship is different. Every community is different. So the question really that I have before us is, how do we live in and develop a community mindset when we're all different? How do we live out all those one another passages that are in Scripture, all those edicts that are there? How do we live those out? How do we build homes that reflect diversity under the same roof? The world's changed so much, hasn't it? So quickly. Way back when I was a kid, the public community had pretty much the same standards as the church community did. They weren't exactly the same, but they were kind of in the ballpark, and now it feels like they're not even on the same playing field anymore. What happens when the boundaries are taken away? Well, then things just kind of automatically disintegrate or start to disintegrate. Isaiah chapter 5, verses 4 and 5. It says this: "What more could have been done for my vineyard that I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I will tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I'll take away its hedge, and it will be destroyed. I will break down its wall, and it will be trampled." Notice, God doesn't need to do anything other than just take away the hedge, take away the wall, and the vineyard disintegrates. Take down the wall and anything can happen. There's no protection. There's no safety. Anyone can come in and take the produce. There are no boundaries, and we fear that. Our answer is to put up boundaries. The puzzle has no boundaries, so it's much harder because it doesn't have a boundary. It's harder to do, and it makes life difficult, and it's true of life. And so our human reaction is we're not sure what the boundaries are, so we're going to throw up boundaries that we understand, boundaries that we kind of like, boundaries that we desire. Because those are the ones that we like, we think they're right or wrong. And we have to be careful about what boundaries are put in place. We do it in our relationships, in our churches, in our parenting, in our marriages. We put those boundaries in. We call them expectations. All of a sudden we have expectations of people. And often those expectations are the things we grew up with or the things we understand, the things we know, and we think everybody should live that way. Should see the same thing. But everyone is different, and life has variety. And that's what we're going to be exploring in this series is, with that variety and with that difference, how do we grow and help each other grow in our relationships, in our family, in our church community? I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. I think we just need to keep it in front of our mind as we call attention to it, that it really boils down to two parts of our theology. And the combination of these things really drive our living. And the first part is the way we view God. Who's God the way we view Him? That's the first part. And I'm not going to go into all the theological stuff. Those things don't matter. It really matters to how I view God. Things that I mentioned before. If we view God as kind of a scorekeeper or as a tyrant, as someone who wants to force us to do something, if we see Him as an impersonal force, or what I said a couple weeks ago, a candy machine, then we look at it and we think, well, his job is mainly to keep us in line, or he's someone to fear, or his main job is really to make my life a little bit easier, a little bit happier. In our thoughts of God, whatever that is, that's one part of the equation, but there's a second part that we often don't talk about, and that is how we think God sees us. What's God's view of us? Because that's really how we end up living, is how we think God sees us is how we end up living. And so if we have a flawed theology in either of those areas regarding God's attitude toward us especially, it kind of sets off this domino effect of flawed decisions in living. So I'm going to build on those ideas, but before we do, I want to go back to that book and the purpose of the series. So the series we're calling Living Grace. That's the series. The picture that we see is a picture of a puzzle. See how we tied that together? I just need to point that out to you. That it's a puzzle, but it's a waterfall in the background. In that background, because grace is like a deluge, it's not just this little drop of water, a trickle or something like that, but God's grace is just falling on us all the time. All the time. It is giving grace, and that grace comes with power, but it's not bound by little things, it's huge. So the book that we're using is actually called Grace-Based Parenting. And yes, it's a parenting book. And I want to do something for parents and to really connect in that way. But here's what I know, and I've read through the book a few times, is the principles of parenting fit so well in living a grace-based community. A grace-based community. So I didn't want to tell you the name of the book right away, because as soon as you hear parenting, you're thinking, oh, I'm not a parent, so that can't. It's for you. If you're a grandparent, it's for you. If your kids are out of the house, it's for you. It's for you if you're in any relationship at all, whether it's individual or a church community relationship. See, they're life principles, and we're going to build on those. We're building this series on that idea of grace-based community. Our Community 411 groups are going to be, some of them are going to be using a video that goes with this, and we've got a study that we've reworded and to use for both in a parenting aspect, but in a community building aspect as well. And my prayer through this whole series as we talk through this is that we figure out a way to live daily God's grace. Because God's grace isn't just saving grace. God's grace is living grace. It's living grace. So how we see God and how we believe He sees us is key to how we parent, but also how we build relationships with each other. When we have defective views, well, this combination, Christians tend toward one of two lifestyles. The first defection is this: we end up having judgment. We spend a whole lot of time and energy comparing, and it becomes judgmental. It includes the idea that, and we think this comparison or this judgment, we're building a hedge. We're building a wall. We're building a border, but it's not the right border. This one includes the idea that we keep our kids in line by thinking, what will other people think of my parenting? If my kids act that way, what are they going to think? Not just of my kid, but what are they going to think of me? So I got to make sure that they don't think badly of my kids, and I definitely don't want them to think badly of my parenting. You see, we believe that our kids' actions reflect on saying either I'm a good parent or a bad parent. Sometimes kids are just kids, and it has nothing to do with your parenting. Or just because I'm identified and these are my set of friends, if one of my friends does something I don't agree with, do you think everybody thinks, well, Pastor Don, what's wrong with you? You've got bad friends. We go down these ways in our minds. There are numerous pitfalls of this hedge when we compare, because we actually are taking the joy out of living in relationship with God. Because we're always looking and saying, is it good or bad? Am I good? And we forget that we're not the judge. God is. It says this in Romans chapter 2, verse 1, and this I put on the screen. I'm using the New Century Version for these verses today. If you think you can judge others, you're wrong. When you judge them, you're really judging yourself guilty, because you do the same things that they do. You do the same thing that they do. I hear a lot about people saying, well, that's inconsistent. And I don't think anybody truly lives consistently. Like, there are times we don't live consistently. I'm going to be transparent. I say, we need to follow the laws, but there are too many times I speed. Honestly, that's inconsistent, right? And so I'm actually trying to learn, and I'm getting better, but I got a long way to go. So we tend to live some inconsistent lives, so let's not judge. Let's be open about that. My mind goes immediately, actually, to the Pharisee who was praying to God. He's saying, God, thank you so much. Not that I'm in relationship with you and that you love me and that you're pouring your grace and mercy into my life. But what does he say? Thank you that I'm not like that guy over there. And in the temple, in God's presence, it's all about comparison for him. How often do we think, well, I'm not like that. I'd never be that Pharisee. I'd never just say I'm better than him. But I've seen it in parents of kids and youth. I've heard similar stories with my own ears. Wow, I'm glad my kids aren't like that. That's not God's hedge. That hedge allows destruction actually to come into the family and come into the church family, because we get to decide instead of letting God, because we're looking with judgmental eyes. There's a second defection, and that is a legalistic attitude. I've talked a lot about this. We build hedges that try to make sure that we do everything right. This is the idea that God's keeping score, and my job is to make sure that the score is in my favor. We need to make sure that God sees the scale in my direction. There's always more to do. We've become really, really busy because we owe God. I mean, Jesus did a lot for us. He gave his life. I'm in God's family because he gave so much, so I owe him. We think that we just need to try harder and to get rid of our sin and get rid of the issues that we know displease God, and then God's going to be more pleased with me. There's this feeling that God must see the bad in me. And so I have to make sure that he sees the good. That means I have to have a lot of good for him to look at that bad, because that's what I want him to see. And so we end up being legalistic about it, what that looks like. Our kids get this idea that we're always watching over them to make sure you are in line no matter what. They can't make a mistake, especially if somebody else is watching. We have this idea that we have to reimburse God's cost somehow. And it's just not true. Romans 4, verse 5, it says, "But people cannot do any work that will make them right with God." We can't. And the good news is we don't have to. If we live with a judgmental comparison attitude, then we easily approach life with a spiritually superior perspective. My view, how I interpret Scripture, how I do this is the way it should be. It includes our kids. When they leave home, they have this idea that, hey, I'm good. And I remember when I was being interviewed for going into a master's for Christian camping, which is part of my degree. And I applied for this internship position, and I thought as I'm applying, because of the denomination I was with, they'd be delighted to have me because I've got this background. And that's what I thought. And they accepted me. But in the process afterward, I realized that they didn't think so highly of that denomination. It was a check against me, not a check for me. I was surprised because I came from a very conservative church structure. And they weren't overly excited about that. You see, the legalistic attitude lends itself to this sense of guilt and shame as well. Like we can't ever have enough, be enough, get enough. I can't do enough for God, and so we're always feeling guilty. We should do more, or shame, like, why did I shouldn't have done that. And we may not have, but isn't that why Jesus died? So I didn't have to carry the guilt and shame. I think it's really important. The truth is that neither of these images are really God's hedge. That's not His border. Both are based on fear and doubt. And the perspectives are actually both man-based and reflect a flawed view of how we think God sees us as people, as Christians, as parents. Parenting and even living with these hedges needs to be surrendered to God. To be transformed into His image of us, not how our image is of Him and how we think He sees us. We need to surrender our fears and begin to trust God as He is. 1 John 4:18, where God's love is, there is no fear, because God's perfect love drives out fear. It is punishment that makes a person fear, so love is not made perfect in the person who fears. Love. God's perfect love drives out fear. You see, living grace means that we're entrusting ourselves to God, not just for salvation, but for daily living. It gives a desire to know God better when I don't have to feel all that guilt and shame and I don't belong and I'm not good enough. I want to know that God more. It drives me more to Him. Who He really is, not my flawed thoughts. It allows me to enjoy God. I don't spend nearly as much energy with what other people think and how I stack up to them and their look or my look of life. It gives greater freedom, actually, to keep trying different things and to realize that He forgives my mess-ups. He's not keeping track of them. And we all have them. You see, living grace is having a balanced view. It's a little like this illustration that Tim Kimmel, he's the author of the book, he puts the differences like this. It says, if it feels good, the judgmental attitude says it's probably wrong. If it feels good, the legalist attitude says, stop it. Just quit. But the grace attitude says, examine it. There's a world of difference, isn't there? How do we live? Do we live by saying it's got to be wrong? Do we live by saying, just stop it? Or do we say, I should examine this. We should look at this. See, living grace begins with a keen awareness that we have feet of clay, that we all have tendency to sin, and that we're very aware of our own need for grace and forgiveness. We need that, actually. We need His grace and forgiveness, and God raises us, His children, in this waterfall of grace and forgiveness. And when we feel inadequate, fragile, weak, when we're hurting and wounded because of our mess up, God pours grace and forgiveness into our lives. But He doesn't do it as a judge or a scorekeeper, or one who's saying, you just get what you're getting what you deserve. Now, through this series, we're going to also be talking about the fact that grace isn't all there is. See, one reason grace is downplayed in people's minds and why we go to these other hedges in parenting and building each other up is because we equate, well, if grace is the answer for everything, then there's the removal of truth, and you can't. Grace isn't grace if there is no truth. We'll be dealing with that idea in the weeks ahead, but truth is an inseparable part of grace. Positive communities of faith and home have both grace and truth in them. God's truth gives us the correct hedges of life. And when we can break into those hedges, we have those hedges, and even when we break through that hedge, the hedge is there, and sometimes we break through. What's God's answer? He doesn't hit me with a lightning rod. He says, my grace is sufficient to forgive. To forgive. It doesn't say to excuse. It says to forgive. So as I come to the finish, I want to drop in a little bit of where we're going so that you know the weeks ahead. In the weeks ahead, we're going to be talking about 3 fundamental driving inner needs that we all have. We have them as kids, but we carry them into our adult life as well. And it's important to know them because if we don't know them, we can't meet them. If we don't know them, we can't help our kids understand them. If we don't know them, how are we going to help each other in our church family? The 3 are this: security, significance, and strength. Security, significance, and strength. We meet those needs with love, with purpose, and with hope. Grace is a process, folks. It takes time. It's not just this nice, easy uphill trajectory and everything. Look, it's cyclical. It goes up and down, or it can be in a cycle. And we know that it's growing. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. It says this, but grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. See, if we seek to control our life and our parenting through fear, by behavior modification, which is the thing that we often do, or because of what others' images of our is, then we actually are minimizing God's grace and God's truth. We actually make life more difficult than He ever meant it to be. So let's commit. Let's commit. Even now, as we reflect and sing, let's commit to learning how to build our homes and our church family with grace at the core of everything that we do.